This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Reighan Gillam, who teaches in the Department of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at Dartmouth University. Along with a number of scholarly articles, she has published Visualizing Black Lives, Ownership and Control in Afro-Brazilian Media from 2022, and is completing a book project titled Diasporic Agency, Transnational Racial Leverage and Challenges to Exceptionalism in Brazil. As well, she is the host of a podcast series on the New Books Network that was recently honored for its public-facing scholarship by the American Anthropological Association. And in this conversation, we discuss the place of anthropological methods and sensibilities in the field of Black studies, the cultural importance of transnational exchange, and the place of Brazil and related Latin American sites in the Black studies imagination. Hello, Reighan. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. As I was telling you, just as we were chatting beforehand, this is the last day of classes for me. So it's a really great way to end up the semester's classes, have this podcast time. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really happy you made time for it. I've read your book. I think about the kind of work that you do as really something Black Studies needs, thinking about culture and politics and history in Brazil and Latin America. And so getting this perspective on this podcast is really important to me. So I appreciate your time and thoughtfulness for a lot of reasons, but especially to get that perspective as part of the series. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So as a way of starting, we'll talk about your work and talk about the study of Black life. But I wanted to start really with a question about your own journey. What is it that drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to an engagement with Black studies? And what sustained you in relation to that kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'm going to say briefly, my work is on race and representation in Brazil, and specifically media produced by Afro-Brazilians in São Paulo. And I basically was looking at how Afro-Brazilians produce images when on national media you see very few Black representation. And so, my book is called Visualizing Black Lives, and I'm arguing that Afro-Brazilians produce media in ways that foment anti-racism. But I say that because I came to Black studies probably from my parents and from growing up. My parents are Warren and Dorothy Gillam in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and my dad was a high school history teacher. And he had a very strong interest in Black history. And so when I was growing up, if I could choose a subject for a project in school, I think I had to choose a Black subject. And so, for example, in Pennsylvania, students write, there's a fourth grade Pennsylvania history project, and I chose Marian Anderson to do my project, just as an example. And so my dad made me read the autobiography of Malcolm X and Black Boy by Richard Wright, Toni Morrison, just all these different, Black authors when I was growing up. So when I went to college at the University of Virginia, I think it felt in a way natural to major in African American studies. And then I also majored in anthropology. And I think when I was there, it was unique that there were 3 anthropologists who were central to African American studies. And so there was Hanan Sabia, Wendy Marshall, and George Mentor who were there at the time. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of thought anthropology and Black studies sort of, went together. And so that was, I learned that Black studies varies by institution, but that was my initial entry point to it.
I love that.
Which was, I think that was very unique. And then when I was in college, I took a class on race and ethnicity in Latin America with Brian Owensby, and that was in the history department. And then I took another class on the history and culture of Brazil with David Haberly. And I think he was in like either romance studies or literature. And so that basically introduced me to the study of Brazil and Afro-Latin America. And then kind of another turning point in college was when I met an Afro-Colombian activist at the University of Virginia. And she came to talk about Black studies in Colombia, or Black struggles in Colombia. And I remember there were very few students there. There might have been like 4 students in the room, and it was like in this teeny tiny room at UVA. And she was this Black woman, and basically for an hour, she just told us about what was going on with Black social movements in Colombia, and their like struggles over land and the drug wars in Colombia. And so I remember wanting to study these social movements. And again, this came kind of after I took these classes in Afro-Latin America. And so from there, I had also kind of had a little epiphany, like I wanted to go to grad school. And so I decided to apply to graduate school, and but instead of Colombia, I decided on Brazil because I had taken that class, and I thought probably erroneously that Colombia would be too dangerous at the time. And so I applied to PhD programs and got into Cornell. And then during my time there, I was, searching for like a lens through which to frame the study. I knew I wanted to study social movements, but I wasn't sure like, where am I going to do this research? And so as I was in the beginning of my program, the Our TV television network, or TV da Gente in Portuguese, was founded as the first Black television network in Brazil. So I decided to make that my dissertation research project. And it took me to this world of film and media produced by Afro-Brazilians. And so that's kind of where I've been ever since.
I love that. I mean, there's all the academic stuff about, this really interesting moment of discovering both anthropology and Black studies in the same place at the same time. But I have to say, a 4th grade project on Marian Anderson and the book list you had about, your father as an educator, these are the books that I read. And I think you said had to read. I would have to dial back. But I like that. I mean, my own children are being raised by 2 educators, and this gives me hope that all these, you have to read this, you have to choose these kinds of topics. There's no chance you have access to your 4th grade Marian Anderson?
I do. I was just home for Thanksgiving, and my dad has it on like a chair in the living room.
I love that.
And it also has my poster of George Washington Carver, the collage I made of him as well, sitting on top of it. So it's all there.
I think we all compile these things. My oldest, I have this picture that I always have on my phone or on my background of him holding a poster of Langston Hughes giving the peace sign as he's holding it, some teenager pose. But it's so interesting. And I think probably a lot of what we're going to talk about, and it's certainly something I find really interesting about your work, is that not that discovery of Black studies, but that fusion of Black studies and anthropological research. Because when you said that, that this was your way in, I thought that's actually probably a small team that actually gets into Black studies that way. But it's so important because I think sociology, for example, or political science in terms of social sciences is so dominant in Black studies as the social sciences. But that work that you do that blends media studies and all of that, that's a different horizon of the field. So I like the idea that it goes back to this 4th grade Marian Anderson project. I also have a small obsession with Marian Anderson. So, maybe you should publish this work at some point. Well, let me ask you about how you think about the field of Black studies. It has an interesting origin that has a tension at its foundation. One was the demand in the late 1960s that the Black intellectual tradition have a representation in higher education, in curricula, in departments. And Black studies was that way of saying, well, here will be a place where we study Black ideas, Black history, Black art, right? But that was also at a time when Black liberation struggle in the in the post-civil rights era was really pressing hard on with demands to break down that boundary between, what education is, what college is, what a university is, and questions of community justice and community representation. And so in the former case, it's really that descriptive dimension of Black studies that motivates the founding of the field, right? To describe Black life and to describe the tradition and deepen it. And the prescriptive dimension, which is so linked to that political struggle. And I think that continues to be a tension at the heart of the field, but it certainly was there at the origin. And so for me, I'm always interested in how people who work in Black studies or with Black studies as a framework, how you imagine the field 50-something years since its founding in relation to this origin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think of, I don't know, I try to think of the field of Black studies, I guess, as expansively as possible. And so I think it's critical to highlight, as you just explained, the origins of the field in like student activism on college campuses, for Black professors, for better treatment of Black students, for classes on Black people, as you just said. But I see also like Black studies including not just the United States, but also the globe, and that's probably like the anthropology background coming in. And so I always think of African American and the American being like the Americas, like South America, the Caribbean, Central America. And then I also, I always think about Black studies as being interdisciplinary. So spreading across the social sciences, the humanities, education, including like every aspect, I guess, of, human life. But I also think about it as like professors and students, classes, associations, journals, blogs, conferences, books, concepts, concerns that tend to guide us in the field. And I always think like we don't have like a big umbrella organization like the American Anthropological Association or the American Historical Association or whatever. But I do imagine myself to be part of a community or a group of people invested in Black study. And so I see the meaning of Black studies as kind of like reclaiming marginalized or excluded or invisibilized people and ideas. And we kind of like have to make this there. And so like, Black people have obviously been living our lives, producing culture, writing literature, putting forth our ideas, like prior to the field of Black studies coming about. But most of that like was largely overlooked by the university system. And so this produced like this knowledge system of concepts and ideas and models that don't take Black people and their thoughts into account. And so when you add Black people, they don't always fit or they explode these concepts. And so, we have to make our own concepts, elaborate our own knowledge traditions. And so I see kind of the politics intertwined with intellectual and expressive tradition because they're kind of intervening in the system of value that has devalued Black thought. And by bringing in Black experiences and concepts, we're implicitly asking like whose ideas count. Why might we think more about Franz Boas, who was like a central anthropological figure, rather than W.E.B. Du Bois in anthropology? Whose knowledge counts. And so Black studies to me means like kind of reconstituting a knowledge tradition that centers Black people. And we do this in some academic contexts that kind of fundamentally devalue us through their indifference. And so, we have to kind of insist on our value. So.
Yeah, I mean, they said something that really caught my ear there about creating our own concepts, and that's, I think what emerging fields always, want to do, but so many fields in academia are old concepts. And I think that challenge of Black studies to be simultaneously legible because we exist in an institution and we also want to have conversations outside of our field, but at the same time have a kind of illegibility outside, right? The way that creation of concepts means concepts that have a meaning in a very specific kind of tradition and context, and sort of thinking those two things at once is so interesting to me. But especially when you say, whose voices count and, Boas or Du Bois, that's it's interesting that when you put those two names together, because from the Black Studies side, there is no bigger name than Du Bois, but you're right. In terms of an anthropological context, this is a concept innovator rather than an almost boringly canonical figure in the case of Du Bois. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, that's the thing too, like going between these traditions, like, anthropology and Black studies. And so, yeah, in Black studies, obviously Du Bois would take the precedence, but, in anthro, Du Bois was working across different disciplines too. So we should consider him, but we don't always. He's not someone that comes to mind in anthropology generally.
Yeah, I still my PhD's in philosophy, and so I still do philosophy circuits now and then. And that idea of what is a proper text, what is a proper mode of expression, what is a proper set of associations or arguments. Crossing those fields it's always a lesson for me in the specificity of what Black Studies is. It's voraciousness, because I think it spreads out into all these fields. That's why you can be in anthropology and be a Black Studies scholar. But I think you encounter the uniqueness of the field in those moments. So I really like the way you put that. Thank you. And so let me actually then ask you also about your work in relation to the field of Black Studies. As you already talked about, you have this mix of historical studies and cultural history, media studies, but also obviously anthropological methods. And that mix has so many potential insights for the field of Black Studies. And I'm curious, when you think about the work that you're doing and that you have done, how do you think of it in relation to the history of the field, like into the past of Black Studies? How do you think it fits or does not fit in the past? But also, what horizons do you think it's opening up for Black Studies as an inquiry field?
Yeah. I see my work related, I guess, to the study of, race and Blackness in Brazil. And I'm currently working on a book right now on relations between African Americans or kind of Black people in the United States and Afro-Brazilians. And I specifically see myself in line, I guess, kind of with past African Americans who are interested in Brazil. And again, like thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois, like he was interested in Brazil because of this emphasis that they put on racial mixture. And he saw it as this place that was like, showed that even if you have like a mixed race population or populations of like Black and white people, that, racial mixture was possible in another place or possible to acknowledge. And then, but a lot of like past people in Black studies in the U.S., were interested in Brazil. Like I think E. Franklin Frazier also went to Brazil and Salvador and did some studies. But of course, I kind of see myself also in line with like, Zora Neale Hurston as sort of my matriarch, I guess. And of course, she didn't go to Brazil, but she did go to Jamaica and Haiti and Honduras. And of course, the U.S. South in search of Black culture through folktales. But I'm one of those people who's kind of always trying to expand these geographic boundaries of Black studies beyond the United States. And so there can be a central focus on the United States and Black studies here, and for good reason. Obviously, we're currently located in the United States. There's this urgency always upon us to address these challenges that Black people face in the United States. But I also see these challenges and our fates as like globally linked. And so in my projects now, I look at how Afro-Brazilians use African American people and culture in their own pro-Black activities. And I think there's something valuable in engaging this African American history. Afro-Brazilians don't exclusively focus on African Americans. They mainly focus on themselves and their own activities. But there are these moments when they do engage with African American culture. And so, for example, two Afro-Brazilian celebrities put on this play by Katori Hall. It was called The Mountaintop, and they performed it like throughout Brazil in Portuguese. And the play is about Martin Luther King. And like I said, it was written by this African American woman, Katori Hall. And so I'm kind of interested in those moments because I think they show us like the possibility of these global linkages happening like in real time. And they show us that, there is this possibility of engaging, with one another across these boundaries, and there can be something valuable that emerges from it. And I think that this is trying to kind of expand these geographical boundaries of Black studies. And, again, sometimes, falling in line with people in the past who were also interested in the African diaspora. But so in continuing that, but then looking at these on the ground relationships, probably, ethnographically, right, through participant observation to kind of like show us the way of how this can happen in everyday life.
I mean, as someone who does comparative work, and my main focus for a long time has been the Francophone Caribbean and West Africa, and it's been really interesting to me just to think about the field of Black studies and how it does seem to always have this kind of we're thinking about diaspora, we're thinking outside the United States, but this still, even, I don't want to call it the discovery, obviously, because it's not a discovery, but the sudden emergence, even just like 10 years ago of, Black studies should think about this category of Afro-Latino. Mm-hmm. And to your point, I mean, this was something that, all kinds of people historically in the United States, in the Black studies tradition, had been interested in, parts of Latin America, parts of the Caribbean. And I'll ask you about this in a minute, but I mean, I know that your own department is Latin American and Caribbean studies, right? And the way where how Caribbean studies even factors into departments of Black studies. Mm-hmm. I think these continue to be efforts that are, I don't know how to put it, but it's almost like they're in the perpetual mode of restarting. Mm-hmm. Which on the one hand is great if, it makes it easy to say I'm doing innovative, boundary pushing work. But as you said, those roots are always there. And so it ends up, for me anyway, I think of that kind of work as doing what Black studies has always kind of started to do. And how does it get that moment of commitment to it? But it's through production of books like yours.
Mm-hmm. So. Thank you.
But also, I mean, you say ethnographic, but there's also so much media studies and that sort of work that's involved in what you do, and that multidisciplinary, multi-framed approach. I think that's that strength of Black studies. I hope that embellishes your sense of being an anthropologist in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. I think I have. It's like kind of going back and forth sometimes between two areas, and I want to, always bring them together, which can be difficult, like because of the structures of the university. But I always think about like thinking both Black studies and anthropology, or ethnography and Black studies at the same time.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you then about that back and forth that you're talking about. You've mentioned your PhD work was in the Department of Anthropology at Cornell, and now you work in a Latin American and Caribbean Studies department. And so these kinds of movements I always find interesting, and I always want to ask people about this. That you did your doctoral training and other professional appointment work in a discipline, but now working in a multidisciplinary or area study. And I'm interested in terms of both your research and your teaching, how that movement between discipline and area study, if you want to call it that, or multidisciplinary field, how that's impacted what you write, how you think about what you write, but also how you construct classrooms and how you think about the study of Black life as a professor, as a teacher.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's not a coincidence that I'm not in an anthropology department now. And frankly, I probably prefer in a way to not be in an anthropology department. I've liked being in Latin American and Caribbean studies, and prior to this, I've had many academic lives. So prior to this, I was in African American studies and communication studies at University of Michigan, and then at University of Southern California, I was in the anthropology department. But I think that it's been significant to finding community and a place where my work can be legible in Black studies and in area studies. I think I'm like most legible and seem to add the most value in these area studies places, because people automatically, when I'm talking about Latin America, when I'm in Latin American studies and I'm talking, people automatically know, for example, like, oh yes, yes, Brazil does have the largest Black population outside of Africa. There are significant Black populations in like Colombia and Cuba, and the region is still kind of trying to reconcile race and racism in different ways, like than the United States in a way. So people automatically get it, and they see why the work can be important and what it adds to the conversation. And so in anthropology, it's not always that way. And so I've published in anthropology journals. I go to anthropology conferences. And I view like ethnography as my principal research method. But anthropology in a way can still sometimes, like, again, depending on the department, marginalize the study of like race and ethnicity. It's like we can have someone who does that or not. And again, it varies by department, but so it can, so depending on where you are, it can just make you less legible. And so, so I found like the most people who value my work to be in Black studies or area studies. But I always kind of find myself on the margins as well, because in Black studies, I work in Latin America. And in Latin American studies, I work on like Afro-Latin America as well. So it can be hard to find a space, but I think, it's more welcoming in those areas. And then I think like with teaching, I think that it's interesting because I think that, again, depending on the department, I think that I feel like I have more, in a way, flexibility in area studies and in Black studies. Again, I think it's because of that interdisciplinarity. I can bring in different kinds of modes and work that the students can engage with, and do, like, again, depending on the class, like more hands-on activities. But I think I taught a lot when I was in anthropology. I taught methods constantly, so it didn't really offer. It offered the chance for students to obviously like practice the research methods, and so there was a lot of creativity with that. But now I'm not teaching methods anymore, and so I have these like subject matter courses, and they can be they're limited by the fact that obviously, like in Latin American studies, you have to teach mainly about Latin America or the Caribbean. In Black studies, you have to teach mainly about, Black research and culture. But then but these fields then kind of like open up in the amount of things you can bring in. So when I taught at Michigan in African American studies, I remember I was teaching a course on the diaspora, and I brought in like a play. I think it was by Ama Ata Aidu, and it was about like African Americans in Ghana. And so I had students kind of like read out and act out different parts of the play, to sort of bring it to life. And so I just found there was a lot more kind of creativity in a way that I could bring in to those classes in that way. And then I also, I was saying this to you before we started, I also had students make podcasts in one of my classes this term. And so I found that I can do more kind of creative making activities with the students in these kinds of classes too, because they're not having to like gain some kind of practice in research methods. They can the material is the subject matter, and then they can like do with it what they please in a way through either podcast or some other zines. I've had them make zines, some other means.
Podcasts and zines are AI proof. This is what we just had this conversation the other day in my department. It's like, are there AI proof assignments outside of Blue Books? But I mean, so much what you're talking about. I mean, this is what it's not that this is a podcast about me, but like I really hear what you're saying in terms of like what you bring to a classroom as a knowledge expression, as a knowledge product, as a knowledge producer. And, as someone who came from philosophy departments initially, I mean, we're talking about the late 90s when I was really in philosophy departments, but what counted as an object, a thing to bring into the classroom is so narrow, mm-hmm. right? And this idea of dance, of poetry, of sound, of experimental art, conventional art, literature, history, theory texts, all part of an area study, right? Part of Black studies. Like what that has opened up for a classroom for me, I mean, it's very much what you're talking about. I mean, as an anthropologist, the anthropology part is the research methods. And in philosophy, it's like foundations of the history of, epistemology or something. But that moment of being liberated by, in terms of the kinds of things that communicate knowledge, it's a wonderful part of Black studies. It also requires a lot of us as professors, right? Mm-hmm. Because we, all of a sudden, we venture into stuff that is, if we have disciplinary habits, is not where our disciplines necessarily trained us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have to say, by the way, I meant to mention you are the second Cornell University anthropology PhD on the Black Studies podcast. So I think that department is already represented well in this podcast.
Oh, that's great. That's good to hear.
Yeah, it was Elena Guzman. So early on. Mm-hmm. So let me ask a big sort of speculative question about Black studies. I don't know if it's a big speculative question, but a big question at least. What do you think that Black studies has done well historically, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah, this was a tough question. I was really thinking about it for a while, especially the part about what it hasn't done, what done particularly well.
When Ashley and I formulated these questions, I was like, that's the one people are going to love. And then people are always like, what has it not done well? That stressed me out. So sorry.
Yeah, it's hard to criticize something that you love. So, but I will. So I'll start with what I think it's done well. I think that Black Studies has done an excellent job, kind of like taking our case to the public, I guess, or taking our findings to the public. And so, like, I think we've done it on like a large scale with someone like Skip Gates on PBS with his documentaries, like, well, now he has Finding Your Roots, but he's done all these documentaries on like the Black church and Reconstruction and Black in Latin America. And so just as a couple examples, but then, there are people who are working on maybe I might say smaller scale, but no less important, I think, like social media, blogs, podcasts, like what you're doing, like what I do, op-eds, people making documentaries, and museum exhibitions, performances, artwork that kind of communicate these messages that have been like incubated in Black studies, and so, for example, like the blog Black Perspectives gets like many views per post. My podcast was getting on average like 8,000 downloads per episode. And so I just say that to say like there's a desire for this knowledge, like people are engaging with it, they're looking for it. And I think it maintains this theme of like not producing knowledge for knowledge's sake, but for the transformation of society. And it's what you said earlier, the Manning Marable in Black Studies and the Racial Mountain. Mm-hmm. He describes what you were saying. Black Studies is descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive, meaning it describes Black people and their lives. It intervenes in racism and racist stereotypes about Black people and contributes to social change. And so I think like this engagement with the public kind of carries out Manning Marable's ideas about Black studies. And then I was like, again, like I said, I was struggling with this idea of what Black studies has not done well. I think I thought I would say that what I would like to see more of, I guess, and I think I would like to see more space given to ethnography and the social sciences and Black studies. And maybe I am making a case for anthropology, although anthropologists are not the only people who do ethnography by any means. But I do kind of see like a dominant emphasis on archival research and the study of history. And again, I think history is absolutely critical and it's really important. And so I'm not saying this to like diminish history or throw away archival methods, like nothing like that, obviously. But I think that I see less space sometimes given to like contemporary life and the way of examining it through like consistent observation and participation, like the kind of tools that ethnography gives us. And so I think that if I could see like what I would like to see more of, I would like to see more I guess like ethnographic, more space given to like ethnographic studies of contemporary Black life.
So it's almost like you were listening in to or just concluded a search where one of the things we talked about was it was a multidisciplinary search invitation. And one of the things that came up was one of the things that could have really made a difference in terms of some of the disagreements in terms of priorities among in the conversation, as it always happens, was ethnographic stuff. And that we did not have any people working on ethnographic materials. It actually stood out, and it was the first time I had thought about it literally yesterday, and then you bring it up again today. So you need to start training. People go on to do Africana Studies PhDs with ethnographic research. I agree with you. I think it's I hadn't thought of that until really the last 24 hours. So it's interesting for it to come up twice. Do you have any guess why? That may be harder than coming up with a negative, having to try to figure out why. Because it is really curious, because ethnographic methods just seem to be such a habitual go-to for so many ways. If you say, how are we going to understand people and culture? I think ethnographic methods are kind of like first, second, third on people's list of intuitions. But I think you're right. It's not what we do in Black studies.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I do see kind of the centrality of like history, and I think, or like an archive. I should probably just say archival research methods, because that can go beyond like just the discipline of history. And I don't know if it's because of various ideas of like kind of creating like a vindicationist narrative, or kind of this insistence that Black people do have a history in the face of like that erasure. And so I think that's possibly been part of like a Black studies project, is to show that Black people have had history. But this is all speculation. I have no idea. Because I think anthropologists also try to have also fought against the idea of like Black people not having culture. And so, so I think that was like an early, like a mandate or that people took on to. So I don't really know, but it's something that I see. Yeah.
No, it's going to be on my mind since you said it, and I have no idea. I wasn't like, and I have an answer for you, or I have some great insight. I actually find that observation to actually be a little, leave me a little speechless, because I was hoping you had some wisdom on it. It is really striking. So who knows? Maybe this podcast will be viral among Black Studies PhD professors, and we will develop this along the way.
You can think about it more.
Well, let me think of, this opens, I think, really on questions of the future of Black Studies. But let me ask almost a science fiction-y, especially post-election, as we get ready to inaugurate a far-right government. This may seem like a strange question. It feels like a strange question to ask at the end of 2024. But if we think about the future of Black Studies, however many decades in the future, what for you would be a sign of its success? Would it be the would the success be all those disciplines that never dedicated time to the study of Black life are suddenly infused with the study of Black life, right? Which means really at some level, the dissolution of the idea of Black studies, right? It is a sort of placeholder for when, the other fields of study actually study Black life in the way that they failed to for so many years. I think that's one of the imperatives of Black studies, is to be corrective that way. So would the success be the transformation of disciplines to the point where we may not need Black studies? Or is the ultimate success of Black studies to come to an articulation of itself that is undigestible and really not reconcilable with the existing disciplines that we have, and really become something very much more like a discipline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is a great question. These questions all really made me think. I think that, first of all, you mentioned the government coming in. I think that these kind of attacks on Black studies might be an indicator that Black studies has made like a dent in the national discourse. And if something, wasn't considered a threat, then, there would be no need to try to ban it. And I think the attempts to kind of ban it or suppress it might spur more interest, that, in what we're doing in Black studies. And I don't say this to seem to like put a silver lining or like a bright side on all of this, because it's really, it's really it's really a problem. But it's just kind of an observation of the situation. I wish obviously it wasn't happening. But I think that people will continue on in Black studies, as we always have, just kind of making a way. And I'm not sure about this, but because you talked about this, like the disciplines sort of absorbing Black studies or it becoming its own, continuing to become its own thing. But I think it's like Black studies has gained this foothold in universities, like even like more strongly by becoming like departments, obviously graduating majors at the undergraduate level, but now developing PhD programs, seeing those, like there are far more PhD programs in Black studies. I remember when I was in grad school, I think Northwestern was just starting its program, and then I think UMass Amherst had a program, but there weren't that many programs. And I remember talking to people who were master's students in Africana Studies, and they were sort of wondering, oh, should I get a degree in the disciplines, or should I go to a PhD program in Black Studies? And some people did one thing, and some people did another. But now the number of PhD programs is expanding, and students are getting PhDs in Black studies and getting jobs. And so I see I kind of see the future continuing in this way. I think as long as traditional departments sort of refuse to include Black studies beyond like sometimes like one line allotted to it, if at all, Black studies will kind of continue to forge its own path. And I say this too, the academy like tends to run on prestige, whether we like it or not. And me saying that, again, it's not saying that I think this is great. I'm the kind of person who would say like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and everyone's contribution is really important. But the university in which we're based in tends to prioritize like certain publishers, certain presses, etc. But I see these places, like these presses and publishers, that are considered to be prestigious, like they're including like book series on Black studies. They're acquiring journals in Black studies. Like Black studies journals are migrating to these university presses and publishing houses, and people are getting these like fellowships and whatnot. And so I think like this might further build the field of Black studies like as its own entity. But I do think like, I think we have to like stick together as a field in order to like withstand these challenges and these attacks that are kind of here now, but also coming on the horizon.
Yeah, and it raises such an interesting question that's come up across a number of podcasts, sometimes in this context or different contexts, which is also, what does it mean for the future of Black studies in these moments that the institutions of publishing, the institutions of of higher ed institutions, PhD programs, hiring, and so forth. What does it mean then for the kind of work that's done in Black studies when it becomes so deeply institutionalized? I don't think anybody's like, let's be unacceptable to the institution at some level, because we want jobs, right? We want the ideas to live and breathe and students to encounter them. But also with that intimacy come questions. I don't ever want to make a premature guess at what the answer to those questions is, but like, what is Black studies? 50 years more of institutionalization, I think, is its own question. Mm-hmm. But also, and I've said this before, it also struck me when I was thinking about this question when Ashley and I were putting together the podcast. I thought, we don't have a handbook of Black studies methodologies. Mm-hmm. Like those sort of books don't. Maybe it's time for those books to show up, right? Yeah. And those books are always super disputed and conflicted, and people get mad because something's excluded. But that's like discourse. That's where we should be. And maybe that's part of, as you say, this coming into a certain kind of maturity. Because that's one thing I was thinking when you were talking about all these PhD programs, departments, book series, journals. It's a kind of maturity moment, but also with that maturity moment comes maybe, I don't know, this is not autobiographical, but like a midlife crisis. Right? Who am I, right? What should we be? Mm-hmm. How should I conduct my life? Well, let me ask you as a last question, whatever happens institutionally in the future of the field, but asking it sort of in that context, what do you think is the question you would want us all to be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Yeah, it was. This was also a hard question as well, and I thought selfishly, like, I'm asking questions about, how Black people can reach across boundaries or borders and across distance to engage with one another in projects of Black struggle. And so, like, what do different Black groups in different countries mean to each other? What histories and experiences overlap and diverge with different groups? But I think this also contributes to questions on how we see and acknowledge each other in general, both within the United States and across borders. How can we value each other? How can we acknowledge each other, on an individual level, but also as a group level and a collective? And how can we value each other, like I said, individually within the United States and across borders? And so I think this is important, as Black studies is also under attack, and as we've talked about. And so how can we support each other? How can we have each other's back, and how can we band together? Because I think that we're coming into a time when we have to have each other. We have to have each other's back, yeah. And we have to hold each other.
Yeah, and just to be inside the podcast, the podcast with Gerald Horne just came out today, and he was talking about something very similar, and he's like, we need numbers, right? But then we need numbers that are in solidarity. So, I like that. I think that's a really great place for us to conclude, because that, what does it actually mean to have each other's back? What does it actually mean to have in solidarity and respect each other in a moment of coming crisis, as we've said and alluded to many times. And thank you so much for this, Reighan. This has been really interesting and really thoughtful. I appreciate your time, but I also really appreciate your sensitivity to these questions and connecting it to, I think, the really crucial matters of transnational, diasporic, and I will come back to it, ethnographic dimensions of what we do in Black studies. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And this is a great project. Thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, I appreciate that. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Bye.